to finish off our day, I want to welcome back Paul Steiner, the Minister of Micro and Small Business in El Salvador, to kind of wind up, how we got here, quite frankly, and where they're going. I mean, we're living in real time on the first experiment in the world using Bitcoin as legal tender. They are having to redevelop, the whole concept of economic development, which typically is a top-down approach, but empowering the local population, the small businessman, building a middle class really that has really has exited the country as part of the plan and a major part of the plan. So top-down approach, bottom-up approach, education being the key. Paul, I'll hand it to you. I hope I did you justice.
You didn't leave me much. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's been a fabulous day and a half for me, learning so much from all of you. There were a few chats that went way over my head technologically wise, but it's interesting to see how so much of it comes down to a lowest common denominator, and that is cut out the middleman and go peer to peer. That direct connection between the people themselves in paying each other, in saving information, in registering information, in protecting information, even in games and playing. It's fascinating how in all the different parts of life, the blockchain concept really works to bring the people together. And I think if we start thinking about countries on a wider scale, we start understanding that government is really about bringing the people together and setting the conditions for them to be able to thrive in that togetherness. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit, maybe in a more structured way than we did last night, about El Salvador, where we've come from and where we're going, and in particular, why we've elected the bottom-up strategy and how that is applying in terms of Bitcoin, in terms of blockchain, and financial inclusion and other bits and pieces. So basically, at the screen, okay. I've titled the presentation Libertad. Means liberty, freedom, independence, no, liberty. And it's because last month, September, was our Independence Month, and the president gave a particularly interesting speech about liberty and how we've always said liberty, but really this year is probably the first one we can actually mean it for the people. And it started with our proclamation of independence in 1821, and it literally says this in Article 1. Independence must be publicized immediately to prevent the consequences that would be fearful in the event that it was actually proclaimed by the people themselves. We transferred from a monarchic feudal system to a Creole feudal system in 1821. And there was really no difference except the feudal owners. And it carried on through until about, probably went through till about 1928 or so. And even when the distribution of the lands was done, the owners were in jail so that they wouldn't be a problem when they were distributing the lands. It was an interesting way of deciding the future of the country. After that, in 1932, we had a tremendous impact from the Great Depression, and coffee was our main product and our main export, and of course our main income. And so because we couldn't sell very much coffee around the world, our landlords and feudal lords had very little income. They couldn't pay their peasants. The peasants had no food, and there was a tremendous uprising. And it was also influenced by the Communist Party at the time to try and get the workers' rights up. And there was a president called Arturo Araujo who decided he was going to do agrarian reform, where he was going to redistribute the land in order for people to have some rights. And when he got close to deciding to do that, he had a coup d'etat done to him. He went off to exile, and President Maximiliano Hernandez took over. And 1932, we had 28,000 people massacred, which was the unrest that was created. About 28,000 people were massacred, peasants primarily, who decided to protest when Arturo Araujo went into exile. President Maximiliano Hernandez became our dictator and changed a number of things. Primarily, everything had to be decided by him, but he was not really the owner of the country. Those 14 families still retained control of agriculture, and that controlled the economy. And that was what he was protecting. Basically, it started an era of military regimes to protect the great capital. And in 1941, or 48, sorry, at the beginning of the Cold War, the US started to push Central America very strongly towards modernization. And one of the things that they were trying to do was get the country to modernize its way of operating. And the military took that to heart and really started fostering change. The first university, major university, University of El Salvador, was created, and we had tremendous the German is following me, bridges built. Not as nice as the one I went on last night, but beautiful bridge over the Rio Lempa, which was tremendous because it finally connected the north to the south, which we never had before. And so then you started getting more national economy, and we started finding that the military themselves saw that modernization required democratization to an extent, so that the people started pulling their own weight too in terms of deciding what they wanted. And like the military themselves said, the democratic opposition could not be allowed to have more spaces than those that stability of the system tolerated. That was their definition of democracy. And every election needed to be doctored to make sure that they never got more than what the system tolerated. In '80, at the beginning of the Civil War, there was another coup d'etat. And this time, that coup did create an agrarian reform. Now, I'd like you to visualize an economy run by 20 families who controlled all the land. That land controlled all the agriculture, and the whole economy was based on agriculture. All of a sudden, you can't have more than 150 hectares. And the land that's taken away from you, okay, you got paid for it, not very much, but you got paid. But that rest of the land was distributed to suddenly created cooperatives of peasant workers that used to work on the farms. And the problem is they didn't know how to run it. They knew how to seed, they knew how to crop, they knew how to water and maintain, but they didn't know how to plan or run it as a business. And all of a sudden, agriculture just imploded. We had tremendous investment coming into the country from Korea, Japan, because of our cotton production. We had tremendous sugar production. We had tremendous coffee production. At that time, El Salvador was the world #3 coffee producer behind Brazil and Colombia. Would you believe that? A tiny little speck of a country producing that much coffee. And it's still the best coffee in the world. I'm sorry, but it is according to the Gold Cup of Excellence. And I don't get involved in setting that. Neither does President Bukele. That's an independent tasting. But it's true. I mean, I think the winner, the pound sold for over $2,500. 1 pound of coffee. Imagine that. Would you have that for breakfast, lunch, or dinner? Dessert. The interesting thing is that the people that lost all their lands, suddenly were left with very, very little work to do. And they then decided, we've got to do something. And they invested in distribution. Because the war had started, the Civil War had started, and there was no agriculture, you needed to import food and other products in order to sell them and have it in the country. And so what happened was they set up distribution companies, import and distribution companies. And so in order to buy the products, they needed more money, and they started borrowing from what was then already a nationalized banking system. They had been nationalized during the war. And obviously they owed a lot of money. When President Cristiani came to power in the late 80s, he decided he was going to clean the banks and sell them back and privatize them again. And so all these guys that were the biggest debtors of the banks suddenly had their debts cleaned. They issued bonds in order to cover that debt. And that's called democratizing the debt, because obviously it was everybody else that paid for the debt that the country incurred, not those people that they owed the money. Their debt was forgiven, but it cleaned the banks. And the law said that you couldn't have more than 5% shareholding of the banks. But those same people received 85% loans to buy their shares back. That 5% was forgotten about. And even President Cristiani ended up being owner of one of the biggest banks. And so we then suddenly used to be in charge of agriculture, and that was the economy. Now we're in charge of distribution and also finance. 16 years later, in 2006, those banks get sold to international banks, and Colombian banks particularly, and they managed to turn around something like a 35 to 45 times multiplier over what it cost them originally. So all of those families suddenly became globalized because none of that money stayed in Salvador. They also never paid a penny of capital gains tax on those shares. So it all went out of the country. And what that meant was they needed to have a model of business whereby they had to feed this big monster of consumption and distribution and retail that they had created. And so the model was export your best people. Get them to come to the United States, fulfill their American dream, send remittances back for their families to consume those remittances in the retail outlets that belong to these same people. And that was the business model for the country from 2000 all the way through until 2018. If you look at it at that point in time, Salvadorian immigration, illegal immigration to the US was really high. We had tremendous problems. Last year, remittances were still $7.5 billion. And that's no mean feat. And so what we are now facing is, since February 3, 53% of the vote went to President Bukele. It was quite a strong showing at the election. And President Bukele came from almost left field in the the contest, because his strategy and his campaign was about, we don't want the people that have always been in power to stay in power. We want to break that two-party system. The two parties have been allies anyhow over all this period, and the only ones that have suffered have been the people. So what we want to do is bring the citizen to the center of the state. And that is the nutshell of Plan Cuscatlan, which is the 30-year plan for El Salvador. And he became president in 2019. During 2020, we had COVID. Nobody had expected it. It took us all for a surprise. Everybody said, set up camps and tent hospitals. He said, no. We have 35 ICU beds in El Salvador with ventilators for 6.5 million people. We're going to have a 1,500-bed hospital, and that's every bed's going to have a ventilator. And then when we're finished with it, it'll be a teaching hospital for the rest of the country. And that's exactly what he did. 4 months it was built. At the same time, 30 other hospitals were remodeled, and everyone had an ICU center. And all of a sudden, COVID was under control. We were the first to go into lockdown, one of the first to come out in August 2020. Our economy opened in August and September 2020. And the results of 2021, we grew 10.3% in GDP, 52% growth in tourism, 7% growth in employment. That's above and beyond the employment we lost during 2020. 12% new businesses created, 17% more exports, 19% more energy produced, 37% more internal revenue from the fight against tax evasion, 3,300% in energy exports, and 95% reduction in crime. That was 2021. The first 6 months of 2022, that's 180 days, 166 did not have one single murder. Only 14 days in the first 6 months of this year had between 1 and 2 murders. So we can safely say El Salvador has got its murder capital of the world reputation under control. Right now, you can see El Salvador as probably the safest country in Latin America. And I would challenge whether the US is actually safer than El Salvador. September 7th, 2021, Bitcoin is declared legal tender and the digitalization process begins. We have over 70% unbanked in El Salvador. And when I say unbanked, I mean they have nothing close to a way of becoming banked. September 2021, the president launched an offer. If you download the wallet, the national wallet, you automatically get $30 that you have to use in Bitcoin to practice with it and learn from it. We had over 4 million people download the wallet. And since then, we now have an average of about 350,000 transactions every day. And we have a transaction cost between $28 and $29 and growing. About 2% of our remittances are coming via the Chivo wallet, and that's also growing. Our remittances this year are about 6% ahead of the $7.5 billion they were last year. So there is a complete picture of where we've been over the centuries. Plan Cuscatlan looks at creating a big difference in the way in which we look at people. The first article of the Constitution says it's the obligation of the state to guarantee the enjoyment of security, health, education, financial, economic well-being, and social justice to its citizens. And I spoke to President Bukele about this sometime before his presidential election. And I said to him, what would you consider to be like your job description for the presidency? What would you consider your priorities to be? And he said, it's there, it's plain and simple, black and white. I've got to make sure to make advances in each of those 5 obligations that the first article of the Constitution gives to me. And you can see that we've managed to do an awful lot in terms of health as a result of using COVID, not just as a threat, but an opportunity. Our education program, for the first time ever, and a lot of people don't rate this as an achievement, I personally do. For the first time, the syndicates, the unions, are not the people who decide what teacher goes to what school. The teachers are actually being hired for schools based on their capacity and abilities, and also their performance, which means that it's not about who do you owe a favor to now, it's about who's the best teacher for the job. And that is already starting to show tremendous change in terms of students being interested in their classes. It's already showing a lower desertion rate than we've had before. And it's starting to show results in terms of educational achievements by the students. That's something that we're particularly proud of. In parallel with that, we're also changing a lot of the curricula to make sure that it's more up-to-date, it's more technological. It includes English as a standard part of the learning process. It's not going to be an optional anymore. English is automatic. Mathematics is not going to be an optional anymore. It's going to be an automatic. Because we have in universities, we have an awful lot of lawyers and international relations and marketing and communications, but very few engineers and architects and scientists. And if we're going to change the way the economy operates, we need to invent, we need to design, we need to have technological solutions, especially in what we're talking about, which is software and hardware nowadays. Security, well, we've talked a little bit about his achievements in security. In the last 6 months, we've had an exception regimen, which is basically a situation where certain rights of the people have been reduced in terms of the right to be presented before a judge in 3 days. It's now 15 days. The right, virtually that's all the rights that are being reduced, except that we do have the right to enter search and seizure without a judge's order right now, but with a district attorney's order. And the reason for that is that there was a spike in murders in April that suddenly caused a lot of concern, because it was the gangs trying to show force and create a negotiation with the government. The president said, no, this is not tolerable. And so immediately he said, you have been declared terrorists by the Supreme Court in El Salvador. The gangs, belonging to a gang is being considered as being a terrorist. And it's been law for 6, 7, 8 years now, but nobody ever took it into account. And so we have imprisoned 54,500 people since April of this year. And about 98% have been confirmed as being members of gangs and classified as terrorists. So that has had a tremendous impact on the economy, which is obviously the next point that I'm getting at. Whereas before, if I was a street vendor, I had a gangbanger come and charge me my extortion, and I paid my 30 bucks, and he ran off and gave his money to his friend who came with those 30 bucks and said, we know you need money, here's an usher's loan, or here's a loan at, pay me 10 bucks a day for it until you pay me back the 30. And all of a sudden, they were laundering their own extortions. That's virtually gone. They're not charging for entering and exiting your neighborhoods anymore. They're not doing random shootings on the streets anymore. A horrible thing that used to happen was they used to sleep on the roofs of houses in neighborhoods because that way the police could never see them. And of course, after the rains, the roofs are, they're clay tile roofs, so they're full of water and they're weak. And so running around on the roof means you suddenly make a hole in it and arrive downstairs where the people were sleeping. And so they'd kill those people and take over the house and call it a destroyer house. That was standard procedure in places and places to live. The thing about this, and the point I'm trying to get to, is that each one has an impact on the other. And economy, we talked about some of the achievements last year. This year, we're going to have some more achievements. And social justice, well, security is one of the first things that leads to social justice. And we're starting to do a lot of work with the judiciary department to try and make sure that it's no longer a case of having to pay for your justice, but you actually get it as part of being a citizen. We have, I'll do this really quickly because I think it's important to understand. I'm going to rush through the slide. Okay. Large, medium, and upper small makes up 3% of the business. Micro, lower small, and self-employed makes up 97%. These are the different places where they sell their goods, and these are the levels, acquisitive power. A, B, and C buy in the upper segments, C minus D and E, which are the lower acquisitive powers, buy in these. 4.7 million people eat from 1.1 million entrepreneurs and businessmen. So the strategy President Bukele has established is to empower that 1.1 million entrepreneurs and businessmen in order to make sure that they can give a better quality of life to those 4.75 million Salvadorians. And of course, the key issue, and I'm going to jump because I'm seeing numbers dropping quickly, but this is the condition they're in. You know that 98% are financed by ushers? 95% of them, they earn less than $2,400 a month. 94% of their transactions are cash. And they're primarily subsistence. But this is the key issue there, if I can bring your attention to that. They need to invest in order to solidify their business and then be able to grow and create wealth. In order for them to be able to invest in their business, they need liquidity. In order to get that liquidity, they need to be financially included. The banks are not interested in including them financially. But financial inclusion is one of the primary dividends from digitalization and crypto investment in El Salvador. It's one of the primary issues. And I'm going to, in order to leave space for questions, I'm going to ask you, earlier on we talked about Judith, who had the usher loan and paid $640 interest every month on a $4,000 loan. And if you then replace that with a 5-year decreasing loan, it's $99 a month. She pays $3 a day for that loan, and that generates $500 more liquidity. Now that's a special case, but let's say we don't generate $500 per month more liquidity for everybody. But say we manage to get 100,000 people out of that 1.1 million, and we save them $100 a month, which I think is a reasonable reduction and it's a safe bet. 100,000 people with $100 more liquidity every month for 12 months of the year for 5 years is $433 million of reinvestment in the most vulnerable part of society. And why do I say reinvestment? Because what are they going to do with that money? You got $100 more, you're going to buy more food locally. You're going to buy your eggs from her, your beans from him, your plantains from her, and you're going to immediately reinvest that money in your own peers. Now imagine we could start establishing a system whereby Bitcoin investors could fund microloans and charge 25% per annum for that loan. Would you like a 25% return on your debt, on your investment? Well, if that 25% is important to you, can you imagine what that $100 a month is important to those people? And can you imagine what the impact of over $400 million being reinvested in the weakest part of the economy is going to do for a country like El Salvador? Never, ever heard of that level of investment in that part of the economy. So it's an everybody wins situation. We've got a tremendous opportunity to create that liquidity, bring the citizen of El Salvador to the center of the state and of the economy in order to empower him to be able to do what he needs to do to feed better those 5 million, 6 million people. We have a school in El Salvador, or there is a school in El Salvador called Mi Primer Bitcoin, which is represented here. And what they do is they educate students from schools as to how to use Bitcoin, what it's about, how to take advantage of it. They're soon going to start with adults, I believe. But what happens after that? They need to start earning Bitcoin. Because if you earn it, you adopt it. And if you earn it, you not only have you adopted it, but you spend it. And if you spend it, you force other people to earn it and therefore adopt it. And in this very last minute that I have, that according to that last chart there, I challenge you to think, what am I doing with my business in Bitcoin? Are you acting vertically in your niche and doing your own thing? Or are you considering creating the value chain that is going to both impact regulation here and impact development in countries like El Salvador? Because just education leaves you short. You got to employ. Once you employ, you've got to transact. Once you transact, you've got to earn and save and borrow. And all of a sudden, we've got to create the entire value chain ecosystem for crypto. not only in El Salvador, but here in South Carolina too. I leave you with that thought because that's the plan that needs to be discussed. That's the plan that needs to be devised for Bitcoin and blockchain to be effective here and in my country. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. It's always enlightening, to hear, the efforts and the progress that we're making there. Is this one?
You want this one?
Am I? Oh, there you go. Okay, great. Just a couple of thoughts I want to share. We were approached while we were in El Salvador, with Treasurer Loftus, our liaison there, was contacted by a local assemblyman in Apapo, which is a very poor part of San Salvador. And I mean, if you're looking at Bitcoiners for a place to affect change, obviously a direct benefit with what John is doing with Premier Bitcoin, they were approached, to implement a program in half the time of the normal time frame of a 10-week program. Try to get it in before the end of the year, a 5-week time frame, 8,000 students potentially. The cost of that, was projected about roughly about 3 Bitcoin, roughly about $60,000. So big effect for, very small, but incrementally, obviously, for what we can do here in the States to affect similar change. So those are the types of opportunities that exist. I think one of the things that you'd mentioned to us that one of the challenges is that as Bitcoiners, or people looking, potentially for foreign investment, private equity placement, identifying the opportunities, is in itself a challenge because we're just getting started with that whole process. So the microloan program that Paul referred to is, something that can affect a large number of people very, very quickly from that standpoint, with certainly good returns. I'm not an investment counselor. I'm not giving investment advice, obviously, but these are the type of opportunities that are there. If you're a professional looking, to explore other areas, obviously having a second passport these days is a very, I mean, a lot of people are concerned about what's going on in this country. Having a place to go to, in the event of changes that you don't want, I mean, that you can't, we can fight, we can fight for our freedoms, we can fight, but, there are big forces at play. There's no question about it. So, El Salvador provides an opportunity, as other parts of Central America do, but at the same time, we have a changing system there that we can measure, we can see at that point. We can, and don't believe what you read in the papers, because the paper is not telling us what we've seen with the boots on the ground. We're the first delegation from a U.S. state to visit San Salvador, have high-level meetings, see a cross-section of society, talk to the people on the streets, meet with the folks in Bitcoin Beach. Mike Peterson, who helped inspire that, and Billy, that did not start as a Bitcoin project. That was homegrown 10 years ago as a way to create opportunity in the country. Bitcoin came later, but with the injection of funds, on the condition that you can't go to cash with this. You have to create, the circular economy. Use it to, to create the transaction layer. Teach people how to use this, and turning individuals from spenders into savers. And that's an easy thing to say, but until you really scratch the surface of that and understand what that really means, what that really means is that I've got money in my pocket, and at some point or another, I want to build, a slightly better structure to, this. I mean, in some cases, dirt, floors, and so I go out and I buy cinder blocks when I have that money in my pocket, and I store those cinder blocks, okay? So, I mean, instead of, placing money in a bank, which you didn't have the option, you're placing it in a physical good that can do something later on, whether it's hubs for your car or additional set of tires at some point or another that you may need. So, having the opportunity now to bank with Bitcoin is something that, just hasn't existed before, in so many parts of the economy. So, that bottom-up approach is obviously the effort to try to build the middle class, but at the same time, the top-down approach, and I was actually asked this the other day. It was, I said, "Oh, El Salvador, God, what's that like? I mean, it's just got to be a third world country." I said, "Well, it's a lot like South Carolina." I mean, you can go to the mall, okay, and you got a beautiful mall with everything there, and then you go to some parts of South Carolina, and you feel like you're in a third world country. So it's, it really is truly a remarkable dichotomy. But the difference is they've lost their middle class, and that's what we're trying to build. So I'll open it up for questions.
Please, if anybody has any questions, I just forgot to say one thing. All your investment in Bitcoin is tax-free by law, only in El Salvador. That's part of the law. Yes, sir.
I just had a question about, are you familiar with what the details are going to be for are they going to be able to get around the constitutional restriction on the path to citizenship over 5 years? I know there was some talk about.
There's
Hello? Try this one.
There's a 5-year process to achieve citizenship already.
Right.
And it's already in the list of constitutional reforms to accelerate that process. But with $10,000 to invest, you arrive and you automatically get the ability to apply for the residence as an investor. And that's a working permit and residence, like you have a green card here, that's the equivalent of that there. And it starts your process. And that automatically accelerates it too. But these constitutional reforms will go into Congress to be approved later this year, and it needs to be ratified in 2024 with the new Congress that gets elected, and immediately it becomes a constitutional change. So at the very latest, that constitution will be changed in 2024.
Okay.
Which is what, a year and a half away?
Yeah, and then the the concept of the 3 Bitcoin investment in volcano bonds, is that changing, or like
There will be a volcano bond, or as you call it, a Bitcoin city bond. With the drop in the value of Bitcoin prior to the halving, what we're finding is that the risk of, or the cost risk of the great increase that we're going to have as we approach the halving, it's going to suddenly make a bond intolerable if you launch it too early. So President Bukele has slowed it down a bit in order to get to making it a good timing. If the price had stayed up at 60, then it wouldn't be a problem, because obviously it would have stabilized and then come back up at the right time. But right now, what you're doing is you're getting a very low value bond suddenly shooting up in value, and because that value is going to be shared with the investor, then obviously the country loses out. So it's a question of timing. There are other forms of financing via Bitcoin that we're considering. Right now, we've been buying back some of our ready-to-expire bonds. We took care of about half of the value for 2025 and about 10% of 2023. So we've just finished saving ourselves about just under $300 million on the bond repayments that we have to make. And that's going to ease the pressure financially as well. As well as that we're now members of the CAF, which is a South American investment bank. Literally today I got a notification. I have a meeting with them when I get back of the actual investments that we need them to help us with for small and micro companies. So obviously those are loans. But there's a number of different ways in which Bitcoin is going to be able to help in that respect. I'm sorry, you had a question over there?
So in the case of the story of Judith that you gave, how would someone here find a Judith to orchestrate such a, 25%?
Different ways. One of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to create, well, there is already a company there operating, and we're trying to get them to act as a fund so that people in the U.S. who want to invest literally just invest in that fund. And that company is in charge of distributing through loans and doing all the administration and so on. And of course, every penny or every Satoshi that's sent back to you is tax-free. No capital gains tax on it.
In El Salvador.
In
Obviously.
El Salvador,
Right.
yes, that's right. That's right. So you're going to have to pay for it here. Or come and live in Salvador.
Question?
So you spoke of citizens being brought to the center and empowering them and growing the economy through Bitcoin and the power of Bitcoin freedom. From that point of view, if you look at the medium to long term and people are empowered to stay and work and do things to grow the economy, doesn't that mean Bitcoin is also solving immigration problems?
Oh, of course. I mean, there's an awful lot of knock-on effects. Immediately, it's more attractive to stay than to go. And so immediately you decide you're not going to emigrate. Immediately you resolve the problems on the border although Salvador is only about 5% of the problem. There's lots bigger problems by other countries. And we've been reducing year on year. But the key issue, I think, is you've just named it. And that is the knock-on effect of the financial inclusion and the empowerment is to make sure that people want to stay, to make sure that people are healthier where they stay, to make sure that people are more educated when they stay. And there's a whole bunch of knock-on effects, not only the financial well-being.
Paul, one thing we hadn't really discussed in any of our conversations, noting that the cost of electricity in El Salvador is high. I mean, one of the goals of the Plan Cuscatlan, I believe, is to increase capacity, so that it becomes an exporter of electricity in Central America. But I mean, can you just comment on possibly the impact of small mining operations in El Salvador? Obviously, we have a captive audience here along those lines.
Well, we already have miners in El Salvador. The government itself is doing some of its own mining, and we're using geothermal energy for that. I've seen a rather interesting technique for producing energy here that I'm going to go back and sell when I get there. Not only because I think it's an excellent way of funding mining or low-cost energy for mining, but it's a tremendous way to take energy and deliver it to the people where they are when they're in a remote area. And it's a very small capex, and on top of that, it's sustainable and it's if you like bio-friendly. So I think really we're talking of a very, very wide win-win-win type situation. And you will be hearing from me because I think that you really are offering something that is even better than geothermal. I can see that working very quickly. I'd love to see it also combined with hydrogen generation, which I think would be a tremendous boost as well. And I think it goes hand in hand with the process. But it's a different issue and it's a lot more technical. And you know an awful lot more about that than I do. But I do see tremendous value. Yes, sir. No, that was my pet wish coming out. I do think personally, we need to move away from oil-based products. And I think that hydrogen is a tremendous opportunity, seeing as it's in everything that we do. Steel, no. We have a little bit of a steel company, not very big. Primarily, our steel comes from overseas and also from Guatemala. They have a stronger steel industry. We have got a steel plant in Salvador, and Mexico has a very strong steel industry that exports to us. We have a free trade agreement with Mexico too, so that means that we can take advantage of that.
One more question?
One over there.
Are those 14 families still around or in power at all?
They're the ones that pay for the bad news you hear. They own most of the media, and so what you get is a lot of their news, and it's difficult because it's the era of the post-truth. If anybody understands what that term is, but it's lies and half-truths that are being used to shape your opinion, and both sides, the right, the left, the top, the bottom, everybody puts a slant on the news you hear. And in Salvador, we have the primary media being owned by the opposition, an opposition that's now down to maybe about 4 or 5% of the population and dropping. So, yes, we have to tell our own story, and that's why I'm so grateful to this you guys here for listening to the story, for inviting me here to be able to tell the story, and for considering visiting Salvador and finding out for yourselves, which I really invite you to do. It's a 2.5-hour flight from Miami, from Atlanta, from Dallas, a 3-hour flight. You can fly for $65 on Sprint in Miami. You get all sorts of bed and breakfasts out there, and what are they called, the Airbnbs. You are 30 minutes away from wherever you want to go. 30 minutes. My house is 30 minutes away from the mountain, 30 minutes away from the beach, 30 minutes away from the lake, or from 2 different lakes in opposite directions. In 3 hours, I'm in Guatemala City by car. In 3 hours, I'm at the south end in the Gulf of Fonseca, watching huge shrimpers deliver their shrimp to the port. Although right now, that's why I was so pleased about the shrimp we ate last night. We have a ban on shrimp right now to protect the growth. So in the Pacific, we don't have that benefit right now. So I enjoyed that shrimp last night. Thank you very much.
Quick question?
I had 2, but I guess I'll just do the short one. What happened recently with the IMF coming in and making their proposal to y'all, and the president said no?
Well, they haven't actually made a proposal yet. We're still in discussions with them. I was involved in the interviews and the discussions with the IMF when we were doing the review of Article 4 at the beginning, before the discussions began. And they hadn't realized what the impact of Bitcoin was. And I remember the question was, well, what about this Bitcoin? It's a really big failure, isn't it? And I said, well, it's not about Bitcoin, it's about the wallet. Because in 6 weeks, we managed to digitalize 4 million people. And in 150 years of banking, we only managed to bank, what, about 29% of the population. So if you don't call that a tremendous achievement in financial inclusion, and the fact that you can send now $100 no matter where you send it in the world at 0 commissions, and that's, if you go onto the IMF report, you'll see that is now a congratulation to the country for advances in digitalization and financial inclusion. We still don't have proposals by the IMF. The IMF doesn't come and say, do this. They come in and they say, we recommend the following strategic steps in order to reach an agreement. And we're still in that process. Just recently, our equivalent of Treasurer of El Salvador was in Washington meeting with them, I think about 2 weeks ago, And the discussions are continuing. The problem is not so much the numbers. I don't know if you read the Bank of America report on the visit that they did. It's well worthwhile reading it, because it really counteracts what everybody else is saying about our finances, and puts a clear picture on it. It's more a geopolitical, political decision that's taking place on holding things. The pressure is on El Salvador not to be able to fund itself at an economic way and make it more docile in order to interfere. All our lives well, from independence. You saw the most publicized before the people call independence their own. Any more questions? I think we're there.
Yeah, well,
I'll
Thank-
see you in El Salvador.
absolutely. And I want to thank everybody for coming. Just a quick wrap up. To your point, our first trip to El Salvador was in June. 2 weeks earlier, they had conducted a meeting of 40 central bankers coming in from around the world. You heard a lot about it when they got, when it was building up to get there. You didn't hear much about it after that. We saw the photographs, in Bitcoin Beach. I mean, these people were exuberant. They couldn't believe what they saw. So, I suggest to you that a lot of that news has been embargoed. So, I mean, just appreciate that. To the point, we're also where I think Treasurer made a point where 20% of the businesses have adopted Bitcoin. If you read the journals, you read the papers, only 20% of the business have accept Bitcoin when it's been mandated. So here we are with is the glass half empty or half full? I'm going to tell you that's half full, and we need a bucket full, a pitcher full, to fill it up the rest of the way. So there. And with that, I want to just thank everybody for participating in South Carolina Blockchain Week 2022. So. Thank you all very much.